Before Friedrich Nietzsche became known as one of the most unsettling thinkers in history, he was simply a quiet and unusually serious child growing up in a small Prussian town. He was not born into rebellion. He was born into disciplined silence and religious order. Nietzsche was born in 1844 in the village of Rocken in what is now Germany. His father was a Lutheran pastor. His mother came from a family deeply rooted in Christian values and moral seriousness. From the beginning, Nietzsche's life was shaped by faith, ritual, and expectation. When Nietzsche was only 5 years old, his father died after a long illness involving severe headaches and mental decline. The loss left a deep mark. Soon after, his younger brother also died. By the age of 6, Nietzsche was surrounded almost entirely by women. His mother, his grandmother, 2 aunts, and his sister. This environment was protective but emotionally intense. Silence, reflection, and inwardness became natural to him early. He learned to observe rather than dominate, to think rather than speak. Nietzsche was an exceptional student. His intelligence was noticed quickly. He excelled in language, music, and classical studies. As a teenager, he was already reading ancient Greek and Latin texts with ease. Homer, Sophocles, Plato, and Aristotle were not distant figures to him. They felt present, alive, and demanding. Music played a central role in his inner life. Nietzsche composed pieces at a young age and believed music expressed truths that language could not. This belief would later shape his philosophy deeply. At school, Nietzsche was known as serious, disciplined, and withdrawn. He was not rebellious or disruptive. He followed rules carefully. Yet beneath this obedience, something restless was forming. As he entered university, Nietzsche studied theology at first as expected, but his faith began to fracture quietly. Not in anger, not in dramatic rejection, but through slow intellectual erosion. He encountered historical criticism of the Bible, scientific explanations of nature, and philosophical skepticism. Christianity, which had once felt like an unquestionable structure, now appeared fragile and human-made. Nietzsche did not abandon faith because he wanted freedom. He abandoned it because he believed honesty demanded it. This loss of belief did not liberate him. It destabilized him. Without God, Nietzsche saw that Western morality itself was left without foundation. Ideas of good and evil, meaning and purpose, suffering and reward, all seemed suddenly uncertain. Instead of avoiding this uncertainty, Nietzsche walked directly into it. At the age of only 24, Nietzsche became a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel. This was an extraordinary achievement. He was one of the youngest professors in Europe. Outwardly, his life looked successful and stable. Inwardly, he was already uneasy. Nietzsche felt constrained by academic tradition. He believed scholarship had become lifeless, focused on technical precision rather than truth. He wanted philosophy to speak to life, not merely analyze texts. This tension led to his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy. In this book, Nietzsche explored ancient Greek culture and proposed that great art emerges from the tension between two forces: the Apollonian, representing order, clarity, and form, and the Dionysian, representing chaos, emotion, and excess. Nietzsche believed modern society had suppressed the Dionysian. In doing so, it had lost vitality, creativity, and depth. The book was poorly received by scholars. Critics attacked Nietzsche for being unscientific, emotional, and speculative. The rejection wounded him deeply. Yet Nietzsche did not retreat. This pattern would repeat throughout his life. He would speak against prevailing values. He would be misunderstood. He would grow more isolated, and yet more radical. During this period, Nietzsche formed a close relationship with the composer Richard Wagner. Wagner embodied many of the qualities Nietzsche admired: artistic intensity, emotional depth, and a sense of cultural mission. For a time, Nietzsche believed Wagner might restore spiritual meaning to modern life through art. But this hope would eventually collapse. Nietzsche's health deteriorated steadily. He suffered from migraines, digestive problems, visual disturbances, and extreme exhaustion. His body became a constant burden. Eventually, he resigned from his academic position at a young age. What looked like failure to others became necessity for him. Nietzsche entered a life of solitude wandering across Europe, living in small rented rooms, moving constantly in search of climates that might ease his pain. This physical isolation intensified his philosophical work. Freed from institutional constraints, Nietzsche began writing with increasing boldness. His style changed. He abandoned dense academic prose and adopted aphorisms, short, sharp reflections meant to strike rather than persuade. During this time, Nietzsche began developing the ideas that would define him. He questioned morality itself, not specific rules, but the origin of values. Who created them? For what purpose? And whom they served? Nietzsche suspected that many moral systems were not expressions of strength or truth, but of fear, resentment, and weakness. He believed morality often functioned as a tool to control rather than elevate. This realization would later culminate in his idea of the death of God. Nietzsche did not mean that a divine being had literally died. He meant that belief in God had lost its power to structure meaning in modern life. Science, reason, and historical criticism had eroded faith. Yet morality still depended on religious assumptions. This contradiction troubled him deeply. Without God, Nietzsche believed humanity faced a terrifying freedom, the responsibility to create meaning rather than inherit it. This responsibility frightened most people. Nietzsche saw that many would cling to comforting illusions rather than face it. But Nietzsche did not want despair. He wanted transformation. He believed humanity stood at a crossroads. Either sink into nihilism, believing life meaningless, or rise beyond inherited values and create new ones. This tension would shape everything he wrote afterward. And as night deepens and the mind grows quieter, this is where Nietzsche's story truly begins. Not with rebellion, not with madness, but with a man alone asking what remains when certainty disappears. As Friedrich Nietzsche moved further away from academic life, his separation from the world became both physical and intellectual. No longer tied to a university or fixed location, he lived as a solitary thinker, drifting between Switzerland, Italy, and southern France. His days were quiet and repetitive. Long walks, simple meals, hours of writing broken by pain and exhaustion. This isolation was not romantic. It was necessary. Nietzsche's body was unreliable. His headaches could last for days. His eyesight weakened. At times he could barely read or write. Yet in this fragile physical state, his thinking grew sharper and more uncompromising. It was during this period that Nietzsche began to fully turn against the cultural foundations of Europe. Not out of anger, but out of diagnosis. He believed European civilization was sick and that most people mistook the symptoms for virtues. One of the first relationships to collapse under this new clarity was his bond with Richard Wagner. At first, Wagner had represented hope. Nietzsche admired him as a revolutionary artist who could restore depth and intensity to modern life. Wagner music seemed to awaken the Dionysian energy Nietzsche believed society had lost. But over time, Nietzsche saw something troubling. Wagner began embracing nationalism, German identity politics, and Christian themes. His later works leaned toward moral redemption and emotional manipulation rather than tragic honesty. Nietzsche felt betrayed, not personally, but philosophically. He came to believe Wagner was not challenging modern weakness, but catering to it. Instead of confronting suffering directly, Wagner transformed it into sentimental salvation. This realization marked a turning point. Nietzsche broke away completely. The separation was painful and lonely. Wagner had been one of the few people Nietzsche felt intellectually close to. But Nietzsche believed closeness must never come at the cost of truth. This break sharpened his critique of morality. Nietzsche began asking questions most philosophers avoided. Where do our moral values come from? Who benefits from them? Why do we praise humility, obedience, and self-sacrifice while distrusting strength, ambition, and pride? He studied ancient cultures and noticed a striking difference. In earlier societies, values were created by the strong. Good meant noble, powerful life, affirming. Bad meant weak, passive, or contemptible. Over time, Nietzsche argued this system was overturned. Those without power could not dominate physically, so they dominated morally. They redefined virtue itself. Strength became cruelty. Pride became sin. Submission became goodness. Nietzsche called this reversal slave morality. According to him, Christianity was the most influential expression of this moral transformation. It elevated meekness, suffering, and obedience. It promised reward not in life, but beyond it. Nietzsche did not merely reject Christianity as false. He rejected it as hostile to life. He believed it taught people to endure existence rather than affirm it, to feel guilty for their instincts, to hope for another world instead of shaping this one. This critique intensified his famous declaration of the death of God. Again, this was not a celebration. It was a warning. Nietzsche believed that God had already lost credibility in the modern mind. Science, history, and rational inquiry had dissolved faith, but society continued acting as if religious morality still stood on solid ground. This created a dangerous vacuum. If God was gone, then moral absolutes lost their authority. But most people were unprepared for this responsibility. They wanted rules without foundations, meaning without effort. Nietzsche feared this would lead to nihilism. Nihilism, to Nietzsche, was not sadness. It was exhaustion, the feeling that nothing truly matters, that values are empty habits, that life lacks justification. He believed Europe was drifting toward this state. Yet Nietzsche did not want despair. He wanted courage. He believed the collapse of old values created an opportunity. Humanity could either collapse inward or rise beyond inherited morality. This idea led to one of his most misunderstood concepts, the Übermensch. Nietzsche did not mean a superior race or political ruler. He meant an individual who creates values from strength rather than resentment. The Übermensch affirms life even with suffering, does not escape reality, does not seek comfort in illusions, does not outsource meaning to tradition. This figure was aspirational, not biological. Nietzsche believed most people feared this responsibility. It was easier to follow than to create, easier to obey than to risk failure. To communicate these ideas, Nietzsche changed his writing style again. He no longer wanted systematic philosophy. He wanted something closer to poetry, prophecy, and challenge. This led to one of his most important works, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche wrote this book in a state of intense inspiration. He believed it was his most personal and profound work. It tells the story of Zarathustra, a wandering teacher who descends from solitude to speak to humanity. Through parables and symbols, Nietzsche explored themes of self-overcoming, eternal recurrence, and the rejection of herd values. Zarathustra does not preach comfort. He provokes. He unsettles. He leaves people confused and reflective rather than reassured. The book was largely ignored when published. This rejection wounded Nietzsche deeply. He had poured his vision into it, believing it might awaken humanity. Instead, it passed almost unnoticed. His loneliness deepened, yet he continued writing. During this period, Nietzsche produced a series of works that dismantled traditional morality piece by piece. He examined guilt, conscience, punishment, and responsibility. He argued that many moral concepts originated not in justice, but in control. He believed guilt was a psychological tool used to internalize obedience. Instead of external punishment, individuals learned to punish themselves. This internalization made control more efficient and invisible. Nietzsche admired honesty above all else, even when it was painful, even when it isolated him. He believed philosophy should not soothe, but clarify. As his thoughts grew sharper, his personal life grew quieter. He had few friends. His relationship with his sister became strained, especially as she embraced nationalist and anti-Semitic views Nietzsche despised. He rejected all forms of herd identity, nationalism, religion, mass politics. He believed they dissolved individual responsibility. By now, Nietzsche lived almost entirely inside his thoughts. His body weakened further. His writing periods became intense but short. Bursts of clarity followed by weeks of collapse. Yet his ideas continued to deepen. He began reflecting on eternal recurrence, the idea that life repeats itself endlessly, not as a scientific theory, but as a psychological test. If you had to live your life again exactly as it is, every pain and joy repeated forever, would you affirm it or reject it? Nietzsche believed this question revealed the depth of one relationship with life. To say yes to eternal recurrence was to love existence fully, without resentment. This idea terrified him, but also represented his highest ideal. As night settles and the mind grows slower, Nietzsche stands at the edge of his most radical conclusions. Alone, ill, uncelebrated, yet convinced that truth mattered more than comfort. By the late 1880s, Friedrich Nietzsche had entered the most intense and productive period of his life. His body was failing, but his thinking accelerated. The ideas that had taken years to form now came rapidly, almost uncontrollably. He wrote with urgency, as if time itself were pressing against him. Nietzsche no longer believed he was writing for his own century. He believed his work would only be understood later, when old moral frameworks had fully collapsed. This belief sustained him through neglect and isolation. During this period, Nietzsche completed several of his most significant works, each deepening and refining his challenge to morality, truth, and identity. One of these works was Beyond Good and Evil. In this book, Nietzsche attacked the very idea of objective morality. He argued that philosophers before him had smuggled their own values into their systems while pretending to describe universal truths. According to Nietzsche, every philosophy is a confession. Behind every claim of truth stands a perspective, a set of instincts, a type of person. He rejected the idea that reason alone drives human behavior. Instead, he proposed that unconscious drives shape thought. Philosophy, morality, and even logic itself serve deeper impulses related to power, survival, and self-preservation. Nietzsche introduced the concept of the will to power. This was not merely a desire to dominate others. It was a fundamental drive to expand, express, and overcome resistance. Life, in Nietzsche's view, was not about survival or pleasure, but about growth through struggle. Even suffering, he argued, could be meaningful if it served transformation. This view directly opposed philosophies that treated suffering as something to eliminate at all costs. Nietzsche believed such approaches weakened humanity by avoiding necessary tension. Another major work from this period was on the genealogy of morality. Here Nietzsche conducted a psychological and historical investigation into moral concepts. He traced ideas like guilt, punishment, and conscience back to social power relations. He argued that punishment originally had nothing to do with justice or morality. It was about establishing dominance and creating memory through pain. Over time, as societies became more structured, external punishment turned inward. Humans learned to restrain themselves. This internal restraint became what we call conscience. Nietzsche believed this internalization created deep psychological suffering. Humans turned their instincts against themselves, producing guilt and self-hatred. Religion, he argued, intensified this process by framing instinct as sin. In the genealogy, Nietzsche also examined ascetic ideals. The belief that denying the body, suppressing desire, and embracing suffering leads to moral superiority. He believed these ideals emerged not from strength, but from resentment. Those unable to fully engage with life redefined withdrawal as virtue. Nietzsche saw this as a quiet form of revenge against existence itself. Despite the intensity of his ideas, Nietzsche's writing remained deeply personal. He constantly reflected on his own weaknesses, his illness, his isolation, his sensitivity. He did not present himself as an ideal. He presented himself as a test case. Nietzsche believed philosophy should be lived, not merely argued. During this period, he also wrote Twilight of the Idols, a short but forceful work aimed at dismantling what he saw as false idols of Western culture. He criticized philosophers, moralists, educators, and artists who he believed promoted weakness under the guise of virtue. The tone was sharp even mocking. Nietzsche no longer softened his language. Yet beneath the aggression was urgency. He believed society was sleepwalking into nihilism without recognizing the danger. He saw modern individuals as fragmented, pulled between inherited morals they no longer believed in and freedoms they did not know how to use. Nietzsche wanted to awaken responsibility. Another important work from this period was The Antichrist. This book was not merely an attack on Christianity, but on any worldview that devalues life in favor of abstract ideals. Nietzsche criticized Christian morality for elevating suffering, humility, and obedience while condemning strength, pride, and vitality. He argued that such values inverted natural human instincts and produced guilt rather than growth. This book intensified Nietzsche's reputation as dangerous and immoral. Few read it. Fewer understood it. Nietzsche's isolation deepened further. His correspondence reveals increasing intensity and instability. He began signing letters with grand titles. He believed his ideas would transform humanity. At the same time, his health deteriorated rapidly. His migraines became more severe, his sleep irregular, his writing increasingly frantic. In 1889, Nietzsche suffered a mental collapse in Turin. Accounts describe him witnessing a horse being beaten and breaking down in tears. Whether symbolic or coincidental, the event marked the end of his productive life. Nietzsche never fully recovered. He spent the remaining years of his life in mental decline, cared for by his mother and later his sister. He can no longer write philosophy. This collapse raises difficult questions. Some argue his illness fueled his ideas. Others see it as unrelated neurological disease. Nietzsche himself would likely reject both simplifications. What remains clear is that his most powerful works were written under immense physical and psychological strain. He had pushed his mind relentlessly. As night deepens, Nietzsche's story pauses at a strange place. Not triumph, not defeat, but exhaustion. His ideas were ahead of their time. His recognition would come later, long after he could witness it. After Friedrich Nietzsche's mental collapse in 1889, the voice that had challenged morality, religion, and certainty fell silent. The man who had demanded humanity faced the weight of freedom, could no longer care for himself. His productive life ended abruptly, not with resolution, but with withdrawal. Nietzsche was first cared for by his mother, Franziska. She devoted herself to him with patience and tenderness. During this period, Nietzsche lived in a quiet state, often calm, sometimes confused, largely disconnected from the world he had once tried so fiercely to awaken. When his mother died in 1897, responsibility passed to his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche. This transition would profoundly shape Nietzsche's posthumous legacy. Elizabeth had long held views that Nietzsche himself rejected. She was deeply nationalist, embraced anti-Semitic ideas, and believed in rigid cultural hierarchies. Nietzsche had openly criticized these positions during his life. He despised anti-Semitism and distrusted mass political movements of any kind. Yet now, unable to defend his own work, Nietzsche's voice could be reshaped by others. Elizabeth took control of his manuscripts, notes, and unpublished fragments. She organized them selectively, editing and presenting them in ways that aligned with her ideological beliefs. In doing so, she created distorted interpretations that Nietzsche himself would likely have opposed. One of the most damaging outcomes was the misuse of Nietzsche ideas by later political movements. Concepts like the will to power and the Übermensch were stripped of their philosophical depth and turned into crude slogans about domination and superiority. This misrepresentation haunted Nietzsche's legacy for decades. In reality, Nietzsche had warned against herd thinking, blind obedience, and ideological fanaticism. He believed such movements erased individual responsibility. His philosophy emphasized self-mastery, not control over others. But nuance rarely survives political ambition. Nietzsche himself remained unaware of this misuse. He lived quietly, often silent, sometimes singing or playing fragments of music. Visitors described moments of clarity mixed with long stretches of absence. He died in 1900 at the age of 55. There was no final statement, no philosophical conclusion, only stillness. And yet, Nietzsche's influence did not fade. It began. In the decades that followed, thinkers across disciplines rediscovered his work. Philosophers, psychologists, artists, and writers found in Nietzsche a voice that spoke directly to modern anxiety. Sigmund Freud echoed Nietzsche's insights about unconscious drives. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus grappled with the responsibility Nietzsche described. Writers found in his style permission to break traditional forms. As scholarship improved and Elizabeth edits were questioned, Nietzsche's true complexity slowly emerged. He was not a destroyer without purpose. He was a diagnostician. Nietzsche believed modern humanity had inherited values it no longer understood, that people live by moral habits long after the foundations beneath them had eroded. This created confusion, guilt, and quiet despair. His philosophy was an attempt to confront this condition honestly. Nietzsche never promised comfort. He promised clarity. He believed suffering was unavoidable, but meaningless suffering could be transformed through understanding. He believed strength was not cruelty, but the ability to affirm life without resentment. At the heart of his thought was self-overcoming, not conquering others, but confronting one's own limitations, fears, and illusions. Nietzsche's life itself reflected this struggle. He endured loneliness, illness, misunderstanding, and obscurity. He did not retreat into bitterness. He continued writing until his mind could no longer carry the weight. For those listening now, late at night, Nietzsche offers no simple guidance. He does not tell you what to believe. He asks you to notice why you believe it. He invites reflection rather than obedience. He challenges the listener to live consciously, to examine values rather than inherit them, to accept responsibility for meaning rather than escape into distraction. Nietzsche understood that most people would resist this invitation, that freedom is heavier than certainty, that self-creation requires courage. Yet he believed humanity's capacity for growth depended on this risk. His idea of eternal recurrence remains one of his most powerful challenges. To imagine living your life again exactly as it is. Every joy repeated, every regret returned. Would you affirm it? This question is not about fate. It is about acceptance. Nietzsche wanted individuals to live in a way that required no escape, no afterlife, no final justification beyond existence itself. In this sense, his philosophy was deeply life-affirming. Nietzsche did not want followers. He wanted thinkers. As the mind grows quieter and sleep approaches, his story does not end with answers. It ends with an open space. A space for reflection. A space for responsibility. A space where certainty dissolves and awareness remains. Friedrich Nietzsche lived without comfort, died without recognition, and yet left behind a body of work that continues to unsettle and awaken. Not because it is easy, but because it is honest. And in the quiet of night, honesty can feel strangely peaceful.